Welcome to Big Breaking News of America. Genesis Episode 28. Narrative Structure and Literary Features of the Joseph Narrative, Genesis 37:50. The Joseph Narrative and Conclusion, Genesis 37:50, form the final section of the book of Genesis, delivering a cohesive, novella-like story that transitions from the patriarchal focus of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to Joseph, whose journey from betrayal by his brothers to becoming Egypt's vizier ensures his family's survival and establishes Israel's presence in Egypt, preparing for the Exodus narrative, Exodus 1:15. Unlike the episodic, loosely connected stories of Genesis 12:36, Genesis 37:50 offers a tightly woven narrative arc, characterized by a sophisticated structure and rich literary features that enhance its theological depth, emotional resonance, and cultural impact. Framed by the Toledo generations formula and set against the backdrop of the Late Bronze Age, with a likely exilic composition, 587–539 BCE, the narrative employs a chiastic structure, vivid characterization, potent symbolism, dynamic dialogue, subtle irony, and strategic foreshadowing to convey themes of divine providence, forgiveness, and covenantal continuity. These elements unify Genesis, resolve its covenantal promises, Genesis 12:1–3, and bridge to the Torah's redemptive arc, resonating across Jewish tradition, Christian and Islamic theology, and global cultural expressions. This exploration examines the narrative structure, novella arc, Toledo framework, subplots, literary features, plot, characterization, symbolism, dialogue, irony, foreshadowing, their theological and narrative roles, Torah connections, interpretive traditions, interfaith significance, and contemporary relevance, demonstrating how they shape Genesis 37:50 as a literary and theological masterpiece. 1. Narrative structure, a novella-like arc. The Joseph narrative structure is distinctive for its coherence and continuity, resembling a novella, a sustained, character-driven story with a clear beginning, middle, and resolution, unlike the episodic patriarchal narratives. Framed by the Toledo of Jacob, Genesis 37:2, it focuses on Joseph and his brothers, weaving subplots and concluding elements to resolve Genesis themes and transition to the Torah. Novella structure. The narrative traces Joseph's journey from a favored but arrogant youth in Canaan, Genesis 37:2–11, to a betrayed slave, Genesis 37:18–28, imprisoned servant, Genesis 39:1–20, and ultimately Egypt's vizier, Genesis 41:40–46, culminating in his reconciliation with his brothers, Genesis 45:4–15, and the family's settlement in Egypt, Genesis 46:1–7. This arc, spanning roughly 20 years, is unified by a single protagonist and a central conflict, familial division resolved through divine providence. The story follows a classic narrative trajectory: exposition, Joseph's dreams and favoritism, Genesis 37:2–11, inciting incident, betrayal and sale, Genesis 37:18–28, rising action, enslavement, imprisonment, dream interpretation, Genesis 39:41, climax, revelation to brothers, Genesis 45:1–15, falling action, family reunion, settlement, Genesis 46:47, and resolution, Jacob's blessings, deaths, Genesis 49:50. This structure creates emotional and theological momentum, resolving Genesis sibling rivalries, for example, Cain-Abel, Genesis 4, Jacob-Esau, Genesis 27. The narrative's coherence is enhanced by recurring motifs, dreams, Genesis 37:5-11, 40-41, recognition scenes, Genesis 42:7-8, 45:1-3, and providence, Genesis 50 hours 20 minutes, that tie episodes together, unlike the fragmented stories of Genesis 12:36. Toledo Framework. The Toledo Formula. These are the generations of Jacob. Genesis 37:2 introduces the narrative, shifting focus from Jacob to his sons, particularly Joseph, and concluding with the tribal structure, Genesis 49. This framework, used throughout Genesis, for example, Genesis 11:27, 25 hours 19 minutes, organizes the book's genealogical and narrative progression, linking the Joseph narrative to the covenantal line, Genesis 12:1-3. Unlike earlier Toledo sections, which include non-covenantal lines, for example, Ishmael, Genesis 25:12-18, Genesis 37:50 focuses exclusively on the covenantal family, emphasizing Israel's formation, though it acknowledges Egypt's role, Genesis 41 hours 45 minutes, 47:13-26, in fulfilling the universal blessing, Genesis 12:3. Subplots and concluding elements. The Judah-Tamar subplot, Genesis 38, interrupts Joseph's story but is integral, showcasing Judah's moral growth, Genesis 38 hours 26 minutes, and securing his line, Genesis 38:29-30, which foreshadows his leadership, Genesis 49:8-12. This subplot contrasts Joseph's integrity, Genesis 39:7-12, with Judah's failings, highlighting teshuvah, repentance. Jacob's blessings, Genesis 49, serve as a narrative pivot, transitioning from Joseph's story to Israel's tribal identity, with each son's destiny, for example, Judah's kingship, Genesis 49:8-12, Joseph's prominence, Genesis 49:22-26, shaping the Torah's structure, Numbers 1-4. The concluding chapters, Genesis 50, tie up loose ends, Jacob's burial, Genesis 50:5-13, Joseph's forgiveness, Genesis 50:15-21, and his death, Genesis 50:22-26, reaffirming the land promise, Genesis 50:24-25, and linking to Exodus 1:8-14. Theological significance. The novella structure underscores divine providence, as disparate events, betrayal, rise, reunion, converge to fulfill God's plan, Genesis 50 hours 20 minutes, aligning with Genesis' covenantal arc and preparing for the Torah's redemption, Exodus 3:7-10. The Toledo framework emphasizes covenantal continuity, tracing the great nation, Genesis 12:2, from Abraham to Israel's tribes, prefiguring Sinai's community, Exodus 19:6. Subplots like Judah-Tamar highlight human agency within divine purpose, reinforcing teshuvah and communal responsibility, echoed in Torah ethics, Leviticus 19:18. Torah connections. The narrative's arc sets up Exodus enslavement, Exodus 1:8-14, with Israel's growth, Genesis 47 hours 27 minutes, fulfilling the descendants' promise, Exodus 1:7. The land promise, Genesis 50:24-25, links to the Exodus, Exodus 3:8, and conquest, Joshua 1. Jacob's blessings, Genesis 49, prepare for Numbers tribal organization, Numbers 1:4, and Deuteronomy's blessings, Deuteronomy 33, unifying Genesis with the Torah's structure. The novella's resolution foreshadows the Torah's narrative climaxes, liberation, Exodus 14, covenant, Exodus 19:24, and land entry, Joshua 24, framing Israel's redemptive journey. Two literary features, plot development and chiastic structure. The Joseph narrative employs sophisticated plot development and a chiastic structure to create narrative coherence, theological depth, and emotional impact, distinguishing it as a literary masterpiece. Plot development. The plot unfolds through carefully paced episodes, balancing tension and resolution. The opening conflict, Joseph's dreams and favoritism, Genesis 37:3-11, sets up the brothers' betrayal, Genesis 37:18-28, establishing the narrative's stakes, familial division and covenantal survival. The rising action, Genesis 39:41, alternates between setbacks, enslavement, Genesis 39:1, imprisonment, Genesis 39 hours 20 minutes, and divine favor, Potiphar's trust, Genesis 39:4, dream interpretation, Genesis 40:41, building suspense toward Joseph's rise, Genesis 41:40-46. This progression reflects providence, as seen in Genesis 39 hours 21 minutes, the Lord was with Joseph. The climax, Joseph's revelation to his brothers, Genesis 45:1-15, resolves the conflict, with emotional dialogue, I am Joseph. Genesis 45:3, and forgiveness, Genesis 45:7-8, marking the narrative's turning point. The falling action, Genesis 46:47, integrates the family in Egypt, while the resolution, Genesis 49:50, solidifies tribal identity and hope. The plot's rhythm, alternating between personal, Joseph's trials, and communal, family reunion, stakes, mirrors Genesis' shift from individual patriarchs to collective Israel, preparing for the Torah's nationhood, Exodus 1:7. Chiastic structure. The narrative employs a chiastic structure, where events mirror each other in a symmetrical pattern, ABCBA, reinforcing providence and reconciliation. A basic chiasm includes a. Joseph's dreams and favoritism, Genesis 37:2-11, establishes conflict. B. Betrayal and exile, Genesis 37:18-28, Joseph's descent. C. Trials and rise, Genesis 39:41, central pivot of divine favor. B. Recognition and reconciliation, Genesis 42:45, reversal of exile. A. Fulfillment of dreams and tribal unity, Genesis 46:50, resolution with brothers bowing, Genesis 42:6, and tribal blessings, Genesis 49. This structure highlights theological themes, with the central pivot, Genesis 41:40-46, showcasing God's intervention, Genesis 41 hours 16 minutes, and the mirrored reversals, betrayal to reconciliation, emphasizing Teshuvah. Smaller geisms, like the wife-seducer motif, Potiphar's wife, Genesis 39:7-12, Tamar's agency, Genesis 38, contrast integrity and moral growth, reinforcing character arcs. Theological significance. The plot's progression underscores providence, as setbacks, Genesis 37 hours 24 minutes, lead to salvation, Genesis 45:7, aligning with Genesis 50 hours 20 minutes and preparing for the Torah's deliverance, Exodus 14. The chiastic structure reflects divine order, transforming chaos, Genesis 37:18-28, into harmony, Genesis 45:14-15, prefiguring the Torah's covenantal structure, Exodus 19:24. The interplay of personal and communal stakes emphasizes the covenant's relational nature, uniting the great nation, Genesis 12:2, for its Torah mission, Deuteronomy 7:6-8. Torah connections. The plot's climax, Genesis 45:1-15, foreshadows the Exodus revelation, Exodus 3:7-10, where God delivers Israel, echoing Joseph's role as preserver, Genesis 45:7. The chiastic reversal of exile to restoration parallels the Torah's arc from slavery to freedom, Exodus 1:15, with Genesis 50:24-25 linking to the land promise, Exodus 3:8. The narrative's communal resolution, Genesis 49, prepares for Numbers' tribal camp, Numbers 2, unifying Genesis with the Torah's narrative flow. 3 literary features. Characterization. Characterization in the Joseph narrative is vivid and dynamic, presenting complex figures whose growth drives the plot and theological themes, humanizing the covenant and engaging readers across cultures. Joseph. Joseph evolves from an arrogant youth, flaunting his dreams, Genesis 37:5-11, and favored coat, Genesis 37:3, to a humble leader, attributing his success to God, Genesis 41 hours 16 minutes, God has shown Pharaoh his integrity, Genesis 39:9, wisdom, Genesis 41:33-36, and forgiveness, Genesis 45:4-15, model covenantal virtues, prefiguring Moses, Exodus 18. His emotional depth, grief in prison, Genesis 40:6-7, tears at reunion, Genesis 45:1-2, humanizes his heroism, resonating with readers and highlighting chaste, loving kindness. His arc, from dreamer to vizier, reflects providence, with his burial request, Genesis 50:24-25, reaffirming the land promise, linking to Joshua 2400 hours 32. Judah. Judah's transformation is central, from orchestrating Joseph's sale, Genesis 37:26-27, and moral failure with Tamar, Genesis 38:15-18, to selfless advocate, offering himself for Benjamin, Genesis 44:18-34. His confession, she is more righteous than I, Genesis 38 hours 26 minutes, and plea, Genesis 44:33-34, mark Teshuvah, earning leadership, Genesis 49:8-12. His arc contrasts with Joseph's, highlighting redemption through human effort, prefiguring Davidic kingship, 2 Samuel 7, and Torah ethics, Leviticus 26:40-42. Jacob and supporting figures. Jacob's grief, Genesis 37:33-35, and joy at reunion, Genesis 46:29-30, complete his patriarchal arc, with his blessings, Genesis 49, shaping Israel's identity, linking to Numbers 1:4. His burial, Genesis 50:5-13, reaffirms covenantal ties to Canaan. The brothers' transition from jealousy, Genesis 37:18, to remorse, Genesis 42:21-22, with their submission, Genesis 50:18, reflecting unity, prefiguring Sinai's community, Exodus 19:6. Tamar's agency, Genesis 38:14-26, ensures Judah's line, modeling covenantal perseverance, while Asenath, Genesis 41:45, and Pharaoh, Genesis 41:40-46, integrate Egypt into the covenant, fulfilling the universal blessing, Genesis 12:3. Theological significance. Characterization humanizes the covenant, with Joseph's growth reflecting divine grace and human responsibility, aligning with Genesis' theme of faith, Genesis 15:6. Judah's teshuvah and the brothers' repentance emphasize forgiveness, preparing for Torah ethics, Leviticus 19:18. Supporting figures like Tamar highlight inclusivity, prefiguring the Torah's communal vision, Exodus 15:20-21. Torah connections. Joseph's leadership foreshadows Moses, Exodus 18, and the Torah's kings, Deuteronomy 17:14-20, while Judah's role prefigures David, 2 Samuel 7. The brothers' unity sets up Sinai's covenant, Exodus 19:24, with Tamar's agency echoing women like Miriam, Exodus 15:20-21. Jacob's blessings, Genesis 49, link to Numbers tribes, Numbers 1:4, unifying Genesis with the Torah's structure. For literary features, symbolism. Symbolism enriches the narrative, conveying theological themes through tangible images that resonate across cultures and eras. Dreams. Dreams, Genesis 37:5-11, 40-41, symbolize divine guidance, with Joseph's sheaves and stars, Genesis 37:7-9, fulfilled as his brother's bow, Genesis 42:6, and Pharaoh's cows and grain, Genesis 41:17, signaling famine, Genesis 41:27-31. They reflect providence, linking to Genesis 50:20. The motif adapts Egyptian 1e romancy, Papyrus Westcar, c. 1600 BCE, but attributes dreams to God, Genesis 41:16, prefiguring Torah prophecy, Numbers 12:6. Joseph's coat. The ornamented tunic, Genesis 37:3, symbolizes favoritism, sparking jealousy, Genesis 37:4, and marking Joseph's identity, even in loss, Genesis 37:33. Its removal, Genesis 37:23, and blooded return, Genesis 37:31-32, signify exile, while his Egyptian robes, Genesis 41 hours 42 minutes, reflect restoration, echoing covenantal hope, Genesis 50:24-25. The coat foreshadows the Torah's priestly garments, Exodus 28, symbolizing divine favor. Burial and bones. Jacob's burial in Canaan, Genesis 50:5-13, and Joseph's bones, Genesis 50:24-25, symbolize the land promise, fulfilled in Joshua 2400 hours 32. They anchor Israel's identity, prefiguring the Torah's land laws, Deuteronomy 26. The motif contrasts Egyptian mummification, Genesis 50:2-3, affirming covenantal distinctiveness. Theological significance. Symbols convey providence, dreams, covenantal identity, coat, bones, and hope, burial, unifying the narrative's themes and aligning with Genesis 12:1-3. They bridge human experience and divine purpose, preparing for the Torah's symbolic acts, for example, Passover, Exodus 12. Torah connections. Dreams prefigure prophetic visions, Numbers 12:6. The coat echoes priestly roles, Exodus 28, and burial links to the land promise, Exodus 3:8. Integrating Genesis with the Torah's arc. Symbols like bones foreshadow the Torah's covenantal signs, for example, circumcision, Exodus 4:24-26, emphasizing continuity. 5 literary features, dialogue and irony. Dialogue and irony add emotional depth and theological nuance, engaging readers and highlighting divine providence. Dialogue. Vivid dialogue drives emotional climaxes, such as Joseph's revelation, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" Genesis 45:3, and his forgiveness, "God sent me before you," Genesis 45:7-8. Judah's plea, Genesis 44:18-34, is a rhetorical masterpiece, showcasing teshuvah and earning reconciliation. Jacob's blessings, Genesis 49, use poetic dialogue, assigning tribal roles, for example, Judah, Genesis 49:8-12, while Joseph's final words, Genesis 50:24-25, inspire hope, linking to Exodus. Dialogue humanizes characters, with Joseph's tears, Genesis 45:2, and Jacob's grief, Genesis 37 hours 35 minutes, resonating universally, prefiguring Torah dialogues, for example, Moses and God, Exodus 3. Irony. Dramatic irony abounds, as the brothers bow to Joseph, Genesis 42:6, unaware of his identity, fulfilling his dreams, Genesis 37:7-9. Their sale of Joseph, Genesis 37 hours 28 minutes, leads to their salvation, Genesis 45:7, reflecting providence, Genesis 50 hours 20 minutes. Situational irony marks Joseph's rise from slave to ruler, Genesis 41:40-46, reversing his brother's intent, Genesis 37:18-28, and Judah's redemption, Genesis 44:18-34, after his failings, Genesis 38. Irony underscores God's sovereignty, transforming human evil into good, aligning with Torah reversals, for example, Egypt's defeat, Exodus 14. Theological significance. Dialogue conveys chaste and teshuvah, driving reconciliation, Genesis 45:4-15, and tribal unity, Genesis 49, preparing for Torah ethics, Leviticus 19:18. Irony highlights providence, showing God's hidden plan, Genesis 50:20, prefiguring the Torah's divine interventions, Exodus 3:7-10. Torah connections. Dialogue foreshadows Sinai's covenantal exchanges, Exodus 19:24, with Judah's plea, Genesis 44:18-34, echoing Moses' intercession, Exodus 32:11-14. Irony parallels the Torah's reversals, such as Israel's liberation, Exodus 14, linking Genesis to the redemptive arc. 6 Literary features. Foreshadowing. Foreshadowing anticipates the narrative's resolution and the Torah's arc, reinforcing providence and covenantal continuity. Internal foreshadowing. Joseph's dreams, Genesis 37:5-11, foreshadow his rise, Genesis 41:40-46, and brothers' submission, Genesis 42:6, signaling divine intent. The pit, Genesis 37:24, foreshadows his imprisonment, Genesis 39:20, both leading to salvation, Genesis 45:7. Judah's subplot, Genesis 38, foreshadows his leadership, Genesis 44:18-34, 49:8-12, with Tamar's twins, Genesis 38:29-30, securing his line, Ruth 4:18-22. The famine, Genesis 41:27-31, foreshadows Israel's dependence on Joseph, Genesis 42:45, uniting the family, Genesis 46:17. Torah foreshadowing. Israel's settlement in Egypt, Genesis 46:17, and growth, Genesis 47:27, foreshadow enslavement, Exodus 1:8-14, and liberation, Exodus 3:8, linking to the Exodus arc. Joseph's burial request, Genesis 50:24-25, foreshadows the conquest, Joshua 24:32, reaffirming the land promise, Exodus 3:8. The tribal blessings, Genesis 49, foreshadow Numbers' organization, Numbers 1:4, and Deuteronomy's blessings, Deuteronomy 33, preparing for the Torah's nationhood. Theological significance. Foreshadowing underscores providence, showing God's plan unfolding, Genesis 50:20, aligning with Genesis' covenantal arc, Genesis 12:1-3. It bridges Genesis to the Torah, framing the Joseph narrative as a prelude to redemption, emphasizing covenantal hope. Torah connections. Foreshadowing links Genesis 50:24-25 to the Exodus, Exodus 3:8, Genesis 49 to Numbers, Numbers 1:4, and the famine to Torah provision, Exodus 16, unifying the Pentateuch's arc. It prefigures the Torah's prophetic motifs, with Joseph's dreams echoing Moses' visions, Numbers 12:6. 7 Jewish interpretive traditions. Jewish exegesis, Midrash, Talmud, Zohar, Rashi, Ramban, enriches the narrative structure and literary features, uncovering theological and ethical depths. Midrash and Talmud. Bereshit Rabbah, 90:3, views the chaistic structure as divine order, with Joseph streams, Genesis 37:5-11, fulfilled to preserve Israel, Bereshit Rabbah 89:2. The Talmud, Sota 36b, praises Joseph's dialogue, Genesis 45:4-15, as chaste, shaping Yom Kippur readings. Midrash interprets Judah's plea, Genesis 44:18-34, as Teshuvah, Bereshit Rabbah 93:8, linking to Torah repentance, Leviticus 26:40-42, and sees Jacob's blessings, Genesis 49, as prophetic, Bereshit Rabbah 98:3. Zohar and mysticism. The Zohar views the narrative's arc as aligning Sfirat, with Joseph as Yesod channeling divine blessing, Zohar, Ve'ishev 182a. The chaistic structure reflects cosmic unity, prefiguring Sinai, Exodus 19. Jacob's blessings, Genesis 49, are seen as harmonizing divine attributes, Zohar, Ve'ichi 235b, influencing Kabbalistic exegesis and Musar ethics. Rashi and Ramban. Rashi clarifies the plot's providence, Genesis 50:20, linking to Torah redemption, and sees Joseph's dialogue, Genesis 45:4-15, as covenantal. Ramban interprets Genesis 49 as Davidic, unifying Genesis with the Torah's arc. These commentaries shape Parshiya readings, Ve'ishev Ve'ichi, influencing Jewish education, Shevruta. Cultural impact. Jewish exegesis informs liturgy, Salishot, Pesach, education, and ethics, with Genesis 45 and 49 shaping communal identity and hope. It influences interfaith exegesis, enriching Christian and Islamic readings. 8 Interfaith perspectives. The narrative's structure and literary features resonate in Christian and Islamic theology, fostering shared theological insights and interfaith dialogue. Christianity. The novella arc prefigures Christ's suffering and exaltation, Acts 7:9-16, with Joseph's rise, Genesis 41:40-46, and forgiveness, Genesis 45:4-15, shaping typology, as seen in Origen's homilies. The chaistic structure reflects divine plan, Romans 8:28. Jacob's blessings, Genesis 49:8-12, are linked to Christ's kingship, influencing Advent readings and art, for example, Tissot's Joseph's Brothers. Dialogue and irony inform sermons, with Genesis 45:4-15 emphasizing reconciliation, as seen in Augustine's Confessions. Islam. Surah Yusuf, Quran 12, mirrors the novella arc, emphasizing Joseph's trials, Genesis 37:39, and rise, Genesis 41, as divine signs, Surah Yusuf 12:21-101. The chaistic structure reflects Allah's plan, with tafsir like Al-Tabari's praising Joseph's dialogue, Genesis 45:4-15. Dreams, Genesis 37:5-11, are prophetic, aligning with Quranic visions, Surah Al-Isra 17 hours 60 minutes, shaping 8 sermons and literature, Rumi's Masnavi. The narrative's unity influences Islamic storytelling, with Surah Yusuf considered the best of stories, Quran 12:3. Interfaith impact. The narrative's literary artistry fosters dialogue, with initiatives like the Abrahamic Family House, 2023, citing Genesis 45 and Surah Yusuf for reconciliation. It unifies Abrahamic exegesis, shaping interfaith curricula and media. 9 Contemporary applications. The narrative structure and literary features address modern challenges, disconnection, division, and cultural fragmentation, through their timeless artistry. Spiritual engagement. The novella arc inspires devotion, with Genesis 45:415 used in Jewish renewal retreats, Christian apps, YouVersion, 2024, and Islamic platforms, Alim, to address spiritual seeking, Pew, 2023. Dialogue and irony engage modern readers, with Spheria's digital Pashio and VR tours, Israel Museum, making Genesis 3750 accessible, countering digital distraction, Barna, 2024. Reconciliation and unity. The chiastic structure informs peace building, with Genesis 45:415 cited by Seeds of Peace and UN Interfaith Harmony Week, 2024, to address polarization, Gallup, 2023. Joseph's dialogue shapes restorative justice, influencing policy, EU 2021 frameworks. Jacob's blessings, Genesis 49, inspire community building, with Jewish networks, Shabbat, and Christian ministries, Saddleback, using Genesis 49 for unity. Cultural innovation. The narrative's artistry influences literature, Thomas Mann's Joseph and His Brothers, film, The Prince of Egypt, and theater, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, with Netflix series adapting Genesis 3750, 2024. Symbolism, dreams, coat, informs art, ADNES Joseph, while irony shapes media narratives, addressing modern identity and ethics. Educational impact. The narrative structure is taught in Biblical Studies, Harvard Divinity, 2024, with its literary features engaging diverse audiences through podcasts, Bible Project, and interfaith seminars, UN 2024. Cultural impact. The narrative's artistry shapes Jewish liturgy, Ve'ishev Ve'ichi, Christian sermons, and Islamic storytelling, unifying Abrahamic faiths. Globally, it influences ethical discourse, cultural preservation, and social movements, ensuring its relevance. 10 Synthesis, literary artistry as theological and narrative capstone. The narrative structure and literary features of Genesis 3750, novella arc, Toledo framework, chiastic patterns, characterization, symbolism, dialogue, irony, and foreshadowing, unify the Joseph narrative as Genesis' literary and theological capstone, bridging to the Torah's redemptive arc. The novella structure resolves familial conflict, Genesis 37:18-28, through reconciliation, Genesis 45:415, reflecting providence, Genesis 50:20. The Toledo and subplots establish tribal identity, Genesis 49, fulfilling covenantal promises, Genesis 12:1-3. Literary features, vivid characters, potent symbols, dynamic dialogue, subtle irony, and strategic foreshadowing, convey theological depth, humanizing the covenant and engaging universal audiences. Jewish exegesis, Midrash, Zohar, deepens these elements, linking Genesis to Torah spirituality, while Christian and Islamic perspectives unify Abrahamic theology. Contemporary applications address modern challenges, reconciliation, unity, and cultural engagement, ensuring the narrative's vitality. As Genesis conclusion, Genesis 37:50's literary artistry bridges ancient promises to Torah redemption, inviting all to engage its vision of faith, healing, and hope. Narrative unity. The structure and features unify Genesis arc, resolving rivalries and promises, transitioning from patriarchal families to tribal Israel, Exodus 1:7. They prepare for the Torah's climaxes, liberation, Exodus 14, covenant, Exodus 19:24, and conquest, Joshua 1, framing Israel's mission. Theological depth. Literary artistry conveys providence, forgiveness, and continuity, aligning with Genesis covenantal themes and Torah ethics, Leviticus 19:18. It bridges human and divine, with characters and symbols reflecting God's plan, Genesis 50:20. Cultural and interfaith resonance. The narrative's artistry shapes Jewish liturgy, Christian theology, and Islamic storytelling, fostering dialogue and shared values. Globally, it influences literature, art, and ethics, addressing universal themes of redemption and unity. Contemporary relevance. The structure and features guide modern spirituality, reconciliation, and cultural innovation, fulfilling the Torah's call to be a light to the nations, Isaiah 42:6. 11. Conclusion, a literary masterpiece for all ages. The narrative structure and literary features of Genesis 37:50 elevate the Joseph narrative as a literary masterpiece, unifying Genesis and bridging to the Torah's redemptive vision. The novella arc, Toledo framework, and chiastic patterns create a cohesive story of providence and reconciliation, resolved through vivid characterization, potent symbolism, dynamic dialogue, subtle irony, and strategic foreshadowing. These elements humanize the covenant, convey theological depth, and engage diverse audiences, from ancient exiles to modern readers. Enriched by Jewish exegesis, embraced by Christian and Islamic theology, and applied to contemporary challenges, the narrative's artistry ensures its enduring relevance. From the late Bronze Age to the 21st century, Genesis 37:50 invites all to engage its literary vision, shaping faith, ethics, and community in a pluralistic world. Thank you for watching Big Breaking News of America. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon for more news updates. Share our channel with your friends and family members, leave a like for more videos and express your thoughts under comment section.